Welcome, everyone. I think there are still some folks who are signing on, but I want to go ahead and get started, as I know we all spend far too much time on Zoom, but I'm very happy that everyone could join us today. My name is Amy Krappel, and I'm the director at the UF Center for European Studies. The University of Florida Center for European Studies is both a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. And we're very happy to be able to host events such as this one. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and available on the UF-CES website. And we will have a question and answer session following the presentation. Participants can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I want to thank you again for joining us today. Our discussion is on tracking European solidarity during the coronavirus. The talk and the virtual series are supported by the EU's Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet program. And this discussion is part of the UF Jean Monnet Chair's virtual series, Pandemics in Europe, Political and Social Responses, which explores the political and social implications of the coronavirus in the EU, as well as looking historically at Europe's responses to the long-term impacts of previous epidemics in comparative perspective. For details on the other upcoming talks in the series, please visit our website at ces.ufl.edu. But our speaker today, we're very happy to welcome, is Dr. Raphael Loss, who's coordinator of the Pan-European Data Projects at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining the European Council on Foreign Relations in just March of 2020, Raphael worked on US security and defense policy at the Center for Global Security and Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and he was a Fulbright Fellow at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he also earned a degree in international relations. I don't want to take any more time. I'll be moderating the questions later, but for now, I'd like to hand it over to Raphael.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you very much for having me and for allowing me to be a contributing part to this web series. Let me go ahead and share my screen with all of you. Here we go, that should do it. All right, to get the first disappointment out of the way at the beginning, I don't have a doctorate, only a master's degree, but nonetheless I spent 2 years at the Fletcher School. That was quite terrific. Right now I'm based in Berlin, and so it's just after 6 p.m. for me. So today I'll be talking about our European Solidarity Tracker, which is a project that we are currently running at the European Council on Foreign Relations. We set out doing so in roughly March, put it in the field, launched it in June, and it's going to continue through the end of September. But essentially, let me set the stage for you. There we go. So if you remember back and recall sort of mid-February, early March, in the US, there were very few cases of COVID-19, mostly in New York City and King County in Washington State, close to Seattle, but by and large, there weren't very many cases. Europe, on the other hand, was hit quite severely already then. Italy in particular, and you had essentially the public discourse creating two narratives around the crisis in Europe. One was that Europe essentially failed the coronavirus test, that it put its credibility on the line. Germany is failing. The EU is at a breaking point. The Europeans are in chaos and angry with Trump and the travel ban that he imposed. And then the second narrative emerged as well, and that was one concerning China in particular, and the sort of strategic posturing that China successfully seemed to be doing at that time. Whereas the EU was abandoning Italy essentially in an hour of need. So China steps up, helps Italy, helps other countries, runs this really successful mass diplomacy, or at least this is what it looks like at the beginning. That countries, Italy especially, turns to others rather than to Europeans for help in the crisis. We have association with the Chinese Silk Road, and then also Viktor Orban from Hungary playing a big role in this whole thing. And this is essentially the context in which we, as the professional observers of EU affairs at the European Council on Foreign Relations, we're thinking, well, actually that sort of those two narratives that were dominating the European public discourse don't get it quite right. There's certainly kernels of truth here and there, but the EU was doing quite a bit, even in these early weeks of the crisis. And so we set out to essentially collect those instances of pan-European solidarity that were happening, that didn't get much traction in the public discourse, and to collect them, and to visualize them, and to put them out, to promote them a bit, to provide a bit of a counter-narrative. Not that we set out to sort of become the strategic communications director of the EU Commission or anything, but as sort of folks with a pro-European mindset that generally think that European integration is a good thing, wanted to counter those two narratives a bit. Exactly. So with the motivation for the project out of the way, for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on a couple of other things. One, the definitions that we set out for the project, particularly concerning the concept of solidarity, how we operationalized the concept, how we implemented it as a pan-European think tank. And then I'm going to dive into the tool itself a bit, present some of the key findings and interpret them for you. And then I'll draw some correlations with one of our other recent data projects that essentially validate some of the insights that we gained from the Solidarity Tracker, but also raise a couple of more questions. And then as Amy announced at the beginning, there'll be some extensive Q&A and opportunities for you all to ask questions or criticize the whole endeavor. All right, let's get to the definition. So for solidarity as a concept, we essentially laid out this definition. So unity that produces or is based on a community of interests, objectives, and standards. I think this implies sort of two rationalities. Essentially that it is both instrumental and value rational action. I mean, as a good German social scientist, I sort of am obligated to draw on Max Weber here. So this is a definition that he laid out in Economy and Society. Essentially, that action can be both pursued to maximize self-interest, but also to satisfy a sort of value system. And this sort of dichotomy of instrumentality and value rationality sort of fit quite nicely, we thought, what we could observe on the ground in Europe. This interaction between sort of self-interest, self-interested deliveries of medical supplies to other countries, but also this humanitarianism that was very pronounced. And then just as a side note, sort of European for the project, for the purposes of the project, we defined as essentially EU 27, meaning both the member states of the European Union and the European Union institutions. And then we brought in China because of special interests as well, particular interest in Chinese activities that were part of that second narrative that I mentioned earlier. So with the definitions of solidarity and European in mind, we went about operationalizing those two and thought that we could capture what was happening on the ground probably best by separating solidarity into different types. One being medical solidarity, so as I just mentioned, essentially the deliveries of masks and respirators and PPE equipment, but also, for instance, Germany receiving French or Dutch COVID-19 patients and treating them in its hospitals. Then we also thought that it would make sense to take a look at economic solidarity. So essentially loans or economic support measures that were being initiated between the member states, but predominantly by the European institutions, of course. We looked also at declared solidarity, which we essentially understand as declarative acts of politicians and political leaders in support of solidarity or calling for European solidarity. Then we included people-level solidarity as well, meaning essentially private actors, so private businesses or civil society actors, whereas the first three types of solidarity were referring to public actors, so governments and the EU institutions. This people-level solidarity referred to private actors. And then we have a bucket for others as well. Here we try to capture things like border closures and openings to a certain extent. For instance, when Poland very early on closed its borders, one of the things that started happening was German, Estonian, and Latvian ferry operators cooperating to make sure that Estonians and Latvians could make their way to their home countries from the German Baltic shores. This also includes, for example, humanitarian aid that arrived in Croatia following the earthquake, the March earthquake in Zagreb. It's not quite easy to distinguish here between measures that were taken exclusively with reference to the earthquake and with reference to the coronavirus outbreak in Croatia. And so we included those as well and tried to make clear in what context they mostly happened. And then this also includes the relocation of unaccompanied minors from Greek refugee camps, for instance. Outside of the scope of this project were repatriation flights that Europeans conducted. I think this is one instance of solidarity of which the Europeans are particularly proud, but because the European Commission, for instance, did quite a good job of tracking those flights and announcing those, we didn't think that we should spend extra effort on those. We also didn't include, or rather we had originally included to include unsolidarity as well, meaning, for example, countries unilaterally closing their borders. Eventually, just for capacity reasons, we decided to stop collecting data on that and focus on solidarity measures instead. There's still, of course, a little bit of gray zone in some of the items that we collected and displayed, especially as they refer to border issues, but nevertheless, explicitly unsolidary items we excluded. And then also we didn't take account of solidarity towards third countries, which might be of particular interest to folks looking at the Western Balkans, the Eastern European neighborhood, or North Africa and the Middle East, where of course there are sort of colonial ties that have moved France in particular to be active on the African continent in providing medical supplies, especially. All right, after clearing out the definitions and how we operationalized the concepts, we set out to implement them, of course. For this, we sort of developed a standardized Excel spreadsheet template, which put into a nice structure the variables I just laid out. And then we drew on our pan-European network of associate researchers. As an institution, we have associate researchers in all 27 member states of the European Union, as well as one in the UK. And that's sort of the empirical basis for the work that we're doing as an institution, with just 7 offices in capitals of some European countries. But for this pan-European approach, it's really important to us to have people on the ground in the other countries as well. And so we tasked them with collecting data along those different definitions and operationalizations through the standardized template. We collected a lot of data. First, the first batch sort of considered the month of March and April and May. Then we launched the product in early June, and since early June, we have released new tranches of data every other week. And this will continue, as I announced in the beginning, through the end of September. This data, with the help of Tableau, which is a commercial data visualization software, we turned into a hopefully easy to use online tool, which has quite a high degree of interactivity. So you can play around with this after the talk, and I invite you to do so. And I think the tool itself has been received quite well. We were on Twitter in particular retweeted by a couple of European Commission accounts, prominent politicians from various member states as well, but also from sort of civil society has paid attention to this. But nonetheless, that shouldn't obscure the fact that based on our research methodology, of course, we cannot ensure that we really captured the entire universe of all cases of pan-European solidarity in this project. There's limited capacity, of course, and the scope conditions that we have applied to the project limit us to a certain extent as well. But I think, so the data that we visualize and provide here is obviously incomplete, but nonetheless, in its sort of quantity and quality, I think it is at least indicative of the collective response that Europeans have mounted in the coronavirus crisis and reveal some quite interesting patterns. With that, we come to the interpretation and to the tool itself. Let me turn your attention to this box here at the very top that sort of lays out again the solidarity types that I mentioned earlier. What this tells you at this stage is that the types of solidarity throughout the crisis in Europe have been sort of evenly distributed, with declared solidarity assuming the largest part, and then medical solidarity and other solidarity, and people level and economic solidarity sort of taking smaller parts. What you can see here as well is that solidarity by European countries has been distributed unevenly as well, with Germany being listed with 97 instances of providing solidarity to other member states or to the EU as a whole. Taking the lead here, again, this is not to say that Germany is the most solidary country in the European Union, but based on the methodology that we've applied and on the reliability of our German associate researcher, we collected a lot of data on Germany, and I think this sort of reflects accurately with the discourse as a present as well, and especially in the last couple of weeks when the EU decided at the Council Summit in July on the recovery fund, you saw the sort of gravitas that Germany played in the discussions beforehand. But what you also see is that every EU member state has been present and has been providing solidarity according to our definition to other members of the community. France was quite active as well. Estonia was quite active as well. Luxembourg was quite active as well. If we look at the flip side of this, essentially the same data, but filter it by solidarity too, we'll see that the EU and the EU institutions, sort of representing the whole of the community, received a lot of solidarity, but considering the individual member states, Italy, which was really the hardest hit country in Europe early on, received a lot of particularly medical solidarity. If we look at the timeline, this sort of also indicates some interesting findings. I think that the bars might be a bit too narrow for you to really see this, but early on in the crisis, if you look at or if you look at March, April, the first half of May roughly, the purple bars representing medical solidarity are quite large still. And this sort of takes up less and less space as we head into May, and in June, July, and now lately in August, there has been very little what we would call medical solidarity. Instead, sort of the discourse on solidarity across Europe has also really shifted towards declared solidarity, towards other types of solidarity, especially as the sort of border openings become more prominent, and then to a certain extent also turning towards economic solidarity. The people level solidarity that I've described earlier, with reference to what civil society and private actors do, has sort of been present really throughout the whole crisis. And if you look at the network on the right-hand side here, it doesn't really tell you much more beyond the fact that European solidarity has been a really pan-continental phenomenon, that every part of the continent was present here. We placed the EU's institutions in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean just to not occupy Brussels with two hubs, one for Belgium and one for the EU. But yeah, so what this really tells you is from the center to the periphery, European solidarity really has been a whole of continent effort. What we also collected, or tried to collect at least, is sort of a sense of what the public discourse looked like in the different member states. And so if you want to dive into the data yourself, you can get a sense of what the overall discussions in the different member states have looked like. Czech Republic here, for instance, what the public debate has looked like, what the government's position has been on particular issues, economic recovery, and the issue of Corona bonds, for instance, which was hotly debated. But then also on the perception of China as an actor in Europe in the coronavirus crisis. But to not only focus on sort of the national level actors, we've also considered EU actions in contrast to what I just showed you with respect to the member states, where economic solidarity was just a minor part of the equation. Here, for the EU institutions, economic solidarity is really just the overwhelming majority of activities that EU institutions have done, particularly the Commission with its powers and competencies of regulating and approving state aid measures, for instance, for industries in the member states that have suffered from the crisis, but also the whole issue about the recovery fund, the debate about loans versus grants, that sort of played out here. What you can see below is a little bit of a Sankey diagram that shows you that the EU mostly benefits the EU. This is a bit of an oddity, but just a definitional issue. So we defined EU here as measures that the EU institutions have announced or implemented that benefit the whole of the community and not only individual member states. But if you look at the individual member states, then Italy really has been a primary beneficiary of EU solidarity. France, Denmark, Belgium, Poland as well. And those are concerns of the measures that the EU has taken. Lastly, if we look at what Chinese have done, and here we have been a bit more careful with the overall approach and just considered Chinese donations of medical supplies to European member states, to EU member states. And this was just because of all the disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda that was surrounding Chinese activities in the crisis. What you can see here is that Chinese activities have been particularly uneven throughout the crisis, with a lot of Chinese medical aid arriving in Europe in March and April, and then sort of slowing down in May. And since the end of July, we haven't really collected any additional items because there weren't any that our associate researchers reported. And so this stops here at July at the moment. What the Sankey diagram in the case of China tells you is that not only Italy was a beneficiary of Chinese aid, a lot of it went to Germany as well. Quite a lot of it went to Hungary as well, and to Greece and Latvia, Portugal, and Romania. And this is particularly important as we consider the comparison of with the EU Coalition Explorer that I'll be doing in the next step. But essentially, this project has sort of grown, as I mentioned earlier, in a sort of bi-weekly rhythm with new items coming in every other week. Lately, there have been quite few instances of pan-European solidarity compared to the earlier weeks of the crisis. There has been not really the need, it seems, for EU member states to donate medical supplies or perform particular declarative acts of solidarity, as I alluded to earlier. Whereas in the early weeks there was a strong emphasis on medical solidarity, this is sort of shifted to declared solidarity, and then been overtaken by the discussion on the recovery fund and the EU Council meeting in July. And since then, not much has happened. Let me get back to the presentation. Are we back at interpretation at this empty slide? Wonderful. With some of the findings in mind, let me come to a comparison with the EU Coalition Explorer. This is another data project that we're running every 2 years at the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is essentially based on an expert survey of European policy professionals and expert observers of European politics in all 27 member states of the Union. And this was conducted in March and April of this year. And we released the results as the EU Coalition Explorer in July. We asked for general perceptions of cooperation in Europe, but also with respect to 20 selected policy areas, and looked at who particular member states' preferred partners were for pursuing those policy areas, what their interests were, what their preferred level of decision-making was in the sort of multi-level governance construct that the European Union represents. And this has bolstered some of the findings that we had with the European Solidarity Tracker, but also raised some additional questions for us, I think. But if you want to recall the beginning of my discussion of the tool itself, looking at France and Germany and how they are positioned in Europe in the context of the coronavirus crisis, then you could get a sense of the fact that Germany and France together have been responsible for roughly a third of acts of solidarity that we've collected. And those have gone mostly to Italy. They've also gone to France and Germany, reciprocity here, but really across the EU, those two countries have been active. And this is reflected in the fact that, according to the EU Coalition Explorer, when we asked the experts for who their most contacted partners were in Europe, a lot of votes went to France and to Germany, with 30% of Italian experts thinking that France was one of their most contacted partners, and also 30% of Austrian experts thinking that Germany was one of their preferred partners. Talking about reciprocity, Germany for France and France for Germany are also very important partners, of course. But really, the two countries together have a really, really central role in EU policymaking. So this is good news that essentially confirms that for us, the European Solidarity Tracker provided some valid insights here. If we look at the role that Hungary has played in the coronavirus crisis in Europe, this gives you a really neat picture of a regionally centered national policy of Hungary that really focuses on its immediate neighborhood. Italy, of course, is the most heavily hit country, but a lot of what the Hungarians have done is really focus their aid measures in their immediate neighborhood. This ruffled some feathers in Bulgaria in particular, where journalists accused the Hungarian government of essentially ethnic discrimination, because most of the aid that Hungary had delivered to its neighboring countries focused on ethnic Hungarian minorities in those countries. Of course, the other nationals in those countries also benefited from those aid deliveries, but nevertheless, it was centered in regions where there are Hungarian minorities in those countries, and this sort of I think essentially reflects the Hungarian national policy to a certain extent on focusing on the national project, on bringing Hungarians home. A little bit of irredentism there. And again, this is sort of confirmed in what we see from the EU Coalition Explorer. Here you can see again the question of most contacted partners. This time this is by Hungary, and you see that a lot of Hungarian votes went in particular to Austria, to the Czech Republic, to Germany, to Poland, and to Slovakia. Its immediate neighborhood again, not so very much beyond that. If we look at the issue of solidarity with Italy, and remember this was Italy, the suffering in Italy was a driving cause for the entire European discourse, that the EU was failing at the beginning of the crisis and that it wasn't doing enough. This sort of stands a bit in contrast to this very dominant narrative. The fact really is that a lot of European countries have stepped up and provided both medical supplies, but also other types of solidarity to Italy, have shown solidarity with Italy, and not only the bigger countries in the EU, like Germany and France, also the smaller ones like Estonia and Denmark are present here. And even some of the countries that Italy traditionally considers as, let's say, rivals, like Poland, for instance, or the Netherlands. This, I think, supports the argument that solidarity is not only a self-serving cause, but also has a humanitarian angle, of course. And if we look at the votes that have gone to Italy on the question of most contacted partners in the EU Coalition Explorer, there's a very sort of traditional Italian partners pattern, which this time stands in a bit of a contrast to the results of the European Solidarity Tracker. And again, emphasizing that countries that are not traditionally being considered by Italian government officials, or that they consider Italy as a prime partner, have really stepped up and helped the Italians in this crisis. Lastly, I want to turn your attention to the case of China again, and look at where a lot of the Chinese medical aid has gone to, particularly in the early weeks of the crisis. Hungary again was a primary recipient of aid, but also other countries. And if we contrast that with some of the findings from the Coalition Explorer on a different question, here we asked them the preferred level of decision-making on China policy, one of the 20 policy areas, and we gave the respondents 4 response options, whether they would want to deal with their policy area at the all EU level, at subgroup level of EU member states, meaning essentially differentiated integration, or one would want to cooperate outside of the EU framework on China policy, or would deal with China only at the national level. Then there is a bit of a correlation there between recipients of Chinese medical supplies and a sort of national approach to China. This whole issue of sort of Chinese mass diplomacy and wolf warrior diplomacy that emerged in the context of the coronavirus crisis in Europe in particular, but also in the discourse in the United States, of course. And China as increasingly driving a wedge into European unity by gaining a foothold in successive crises in different European countries. If you recall the financial crisis, you had news reports that Chinese companies were buying up ports in Italy and Greece in particular, and this time around in the coronavirus crisis, Hungary, Poland, again, Italy and Greece have been recipients of a lot of Chinese medical aid. That maybe this stands in somewhat of a tradition of Chinese authorities instrumentalizing humanitarian aid for rather narrow political interests. All right, I'll leave it here, open it up for discussion. Of course, I welcome any questions that concern the project itself or my work at ECFR or anything in between, really.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have some questions that were submitted in advance and then a couple of questions here on the Q&A. So I will start with a question from the Q&A. Charlotte asks, how does European solidarity in the case of the COVID pandemic differ from that seen during other crises like the Euro crisis or the migrant crisis? Do we see parallels in the number of member states stepping up, which countries are giving large amounts of aid, etc.? And I would just say this is in the context of several EU leaders recently in the news, really trying to emphasize how much COVID is different from the previous crises in this age of crises for the EU. So I don't know if you've done similar work, but can you think comparatively about the EU behavior in this particular crisis?
Sure. Yeah, I think especially in the discussions around the recovery fund, and the question of whether this sort of represented a Hamiltonian moment for Europe, whether this would sort of lead to deeper integration in fiscal policy in particular, and with that sort of giving the EU as a community and the EU institutions more power and more money to actually pursue an agenda that might be somewhat independent from the preferences of some member states. And you can see a certain divergence there in how European leaders talk about this seemingly Hamiltonian moment with, even within Germany. If you look at Angela Merkel and her party in particular, they emphasize really this exceptional character of this crisis moment, and the fact that now the pandemic really requires a joint fiscal response to leverage really European fiscal capacity to counter this severe crisis. If you contrast that with her coalition partner, even the Social Democrats in Germany, they are much more optimistic about this not really being an exceptional moment, and more like President Macron in France, thinking that this would essentially be manifested as path dependency and lead to deeper integration on the issue of fiscal policy as well, and giving the EU its own budget. And I think I don't think either in German discourse or in the European discourse this tension has really been resolved yet. But comparing this crisis to previous crises and sort of concurrent crises and never-ending crises, I think what stood out in the past 7 months is this perception and probably a certain learning as well on the side of Germany and some of the countries that are traditionally sort of part of the Frugal Four camp, broadly speaking, not only meaning Denmark, Sweden, Austria, and the Netherlands, but countries that sort of align with their preferences. Finland, for instance, and Irish, of course, as well, being much more open about redistributive measures in this moment than in previous moments. Compared to the financial crisis, a lot of things move very quickly. We'll see whether this is good actually in the end, concerning how robust those changes are that have been implemented in the last couple of weeks and months, compared to the ones in the financial crisis. But I think there's a slow but steady momentum towards deeper integration in this crisis as well, particularly in this crisis compared to the financial crisis or the migrant crisis. And I think with what's happening and with what's been happening in Moria, the Greek island of Lesbos, and Greece more broadly in the last couple of days, indicates only, I think, that the migration crisis really hasn't gone away for Europe, and that European leaders just put a lid on it with the deal they made with Turkey. But there hasn't been really a sustainable solution to this. Maybe the newfound solidarity and particularly the ambition of France and Germany to cooperate more closely and to put into practice their cooperation and deeper integration for Europe might provide an impetus for solving the migration crisis as well in the coming weeks and months. But I don't know. Your guess is good as mine.
I think one of the things we might be seeing is the really fundamentally different character of the crises, despite the fact that the hardest hit seem to still be the southern countries. There is a feeling of shared vulnerability to the COVID crisis as compared to the Euro crisis or even the migration crisis, and that may explain a different response. The cynical person would say that it's not lessons learned; it's fear of self-harm that might be pushing some member states towards a more collaborative perspective. But there are other questions from our audience, so I want to give them a chance. There are a couple that I'm going to merge and ask you to try to address in the interest of time. Griffin says, actions speak louder than words. How much weight should be given to declared solidarity? And with that, I guess we could talk a little bit about what does that mean to declare solidarity as opposed to actually demonstrate solidarity? And linked to that, to what extent will this declared solidarity be robust? Asla asks, when the release of the vaccine occurs, and to what extent might that affect solidarity in the midst of discussions about vaccine nationalism?
Cool. No, those are great questions. Thanks very much. I think the issue of declared solidarity in its own right is important to reflect in the context of this project, because we were interested in the evolving European discourse around the question of solidarity. And of course, public declarations, political pronouncements are part of this, not only by political leaders, but also by opposition, politicians, for instance, or former statesmen and women. And so this is one part of the equation here. But I think if you consider this whole political science literature on the question of audience costs, if a political leader, especially in a democratic state, makes an announcement that they are doing something and that gains broad political support, broad popular support, there's really bind for them to follow through, because otherwise they might get voted out of office. Again, how these measures implemented and discussed in the coronavirus crisis play out in the end in electoral politics as well is still uncertain. The major elections in Germany and France will be coming up next year, and in 2022 we'll see whether the governing coalition of Angela Merkel and will be re-elected, although Angela Merkel will not run again herself. Whether Emmanuel Macron will be re-elected. I think in France, his handling of the crisis at the moment doesn't look particularly promising, although his support hasn't very much declined in the context of the crisis. But nevertheless, how this plays out sort of in electoral politics is quite uncertain still. On the question of how robust really those declared statements are, I think this comes back again to the question of audience costs, but with particular reference to the vaccine issue. What you could see is really a joint European effort to procure vaccines and to enter into negotiation with producers of potential vaccines. This is something that the European member states decided to outsource to a large extent to the European Commission. And so the European Commission has negotiated contracts with producers of vaccines for 400 million doses each, so covering the whole population of Europe and some extra potentially on behalf of all Europeans. And this is, I think, really an effort to denationalize this potential dividing issue again of vaccine nationalism that maybe some of this could see on the horizon. Now, what this also tells you is that European solidarity obviously also has a side that is not European solidarity. So how Europeans are interacting with third countries in the world and how they act in solidarity with developing countries, with in Africa in particular, where infection rates are surging as well, how they interact with Latin America, how they interact with South Asian countries, where infection rates are quite high at the moment as well. And then, of course, the interactions of Europeans with East Asian countries, not only China, but also Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. There was just today a call between the European Commission President, Angela Merkel, as representing the German Council presidency, and the President of the European Council, talking with President Xi from China about the issues, also in the context of the coronavirus crisis, how Chinese actions were perceived in Europe, and really the fact that despite Chinese efforts to instrumentalize their mass diplomacy, this has really backfired in Europe, because public perceptions of China have really plummeted in the crisis, not only because of the sort of assertiveness and overt nationalism of Chinese efforts here, but also because of the fact that it turned out that a lot of the deliveries that arrived from China were actually just commercial deliveries and not really what you would understand as sort of humanitarian driven aid efforts on the side of the Chinese. But I think in the international relations of the coronavirus crisis, there's still a lot developing and of interest to Europeans as well.
I almost forgot to unmute, that dreaded Zoom error. Thank you so much. I have just two last questions. They don't really pair well, but I'll go ahead and get them out there so that you have a chance to answer them. One is something of a follow-up, thinking about the recent resurgences that we're seeing and the anticipated resurgence that we're seeing as we head towards the fall. To what extent do you see a repeat of past patterns, either focusing on PPE or focusing on economic or focusing on member state action versus EU action? That is, do you sense a pattern or a trend, or is it just a guess as to how the EU will react now that they have some experience? And somewhat linked to that is Drew's question about your view of on the EU's interinstitutional cooperation throughout the pandemic, and in particular, the extent to which the European Council and the Commission have been able to work together collaboratively in structuring the EU's response to the pandemic.
Yeah, again, those are great questions. Let me start on the question of interinstitutional cooperation between the Council and the Commission in particular. I think there were certain moments where the cooperative approach was really quite productive. There were certain moments when initiatives from the Commission really went to nowhere, and where the member states sort of took the lead. I think you could see this in particular with respect to the Recovery Fund discourse and negotiations, where more or less out of the blue, France and Germany presented their very ambitious proposal, taking the initiative here, and then the Frugal Four, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden came in and said, well, no, this goes far too far to us, and this will only be loans, we'll negotiate rebates, and you're far too ambitious here. And then the Commission coming in and not really consolidating those two demands, but putting even more money on top. And so the proposal that the Commission presented ultimately consisted of 750 billion euros and both grants and loans and significant rebates for the net contributors in the European Union, but really presenting as well an even more ambitious proposal here. So far, the European Parliament hasn't really played a big role. Unfortunately, I think there are some great proposals coming out of the European Parliament, especially trying to align the Coronavirus Recovery Fund with the sort of long-term goals that the EU Commission had outlined earlier. So if you recall that Ursula von der Leyen and her commission only began their work in December of last year. In January or so, they announced their plans for the next 7 years of the commission. And those were centered really on the question of climate action, of digital transformation, of a more social Europe, and a Europe that could act more geopolitical in the world and be a more sovereign actor in a way. And the European Parliament really likes that agenda and sees that the proposals as they were negotiated by the July Council sort of fell short on a lot of those questions, particularly the more transformative aspects of that agenda, and sort of is now pushing to give those more weight in the negotiations. And again, the European Parliament has to agree to this proposal, especially to the multi-annual financial plan for the next 7 years, which is a huge chunk of money. And without consent from the European Parliament, nothing goes anywhere. But I think in conclusion, I would say that things worked between the Commission and the Member States, but there was a lot of crunching in the engine as well. On the question of a resurgence, I certainly agree with you there. I worry as well that I mean, even in the last couple of weeks in Germany and in a lot of other European countries, the numbers have been rising again. What we haven't seen so far, luckily, is a huge number of hospitalizations and deaths as a result of COVID-19 infections. I don't quite know why this is the case, but certainly hospitals are much better prepared for handling the infection now than they were in February, March. If you recall that Italy's hospitals essentially were overwhelmed, they couldn't deal with it anymore. They had to run triage measures and had to essentially decide who they would support and who would have to die from infection because they were overwhelmed. This hasn't happened in any of the other member states so far throughout the crisis, but with numbers rising again, it's unsure whether the House of Cards might not collapse at some point. The member states and the European institutions have already put a lot of money on the table to weather the economic crisis. They've implemented some measures to weather the health crisis. They have established a strategic stockpile of medical supplies that distributes medical supplies throughout the Union now. But again, if numbers really rise significantly and hospitals are again overwhelmed at some point, maybe not only locally in northern Italy, but in various member states at the same time, that might really tip the scale and result in disaster. But fingers crossed it doesn't come that way.
Well, that seems a really tragic note to end on. Perhaps you could give a few more optimistic comments just as we sign off. We have about 2 more minutes. I think we'd like a bit more optimism for the future. So your best case scenario looking forward for the EU as a whole in the context of this.
Yeah, I think in a lot of member states and for a lot of governments, there's dissatisfaction with the July deal. Dissatisfaction with the fact that the future-oriented goals have taken such a slashing really in terms of fiscal capacity to implement ambitious climate action measures to really promote the digital transformation of the Union. But also on the question of rule of law, conditionality, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how Hungary and Poland were able to outmaneuver some of the other member states on this question and essentially prevent any conditionality on that question. And if you couple that awareness with the hope that maybe in the US, an administration will be elected that is more friendly towards the idea of deeper European integration and doesn't think that the EU was created to beat the United States economically in any way, then I think there can be, again, a convergence not only within the EU, within Europe, but also in the transatlantic partnership, that those future-oriented agenda items have not only the potential to really be transformative for our societies, but also renew sort of the democratic promise in Europe and in the United States.
Okay,
Was that more optimistic?
Yes, that is an appropriately optimistic note on which we can end. We are exactly on time. I want to again thank all of our attendees, and I want to thank you, Rafael, for joining us. I was very excited when I found the Solidarity Tracker online, so I look forward to other initiatives by yourself and by the ECFR. So just thank you very much. We look forward to seeing more of what you folks do.
Thank you very much. I invite you all to check out the Solidarity Tracker for yourself at ecfr.eu/Solidarity Tracker.
And you can also find links to that on the ECFR webpage, and we will link to it when we post this talk on the CES webpage. For those participants who are still here, you will get shunted to a survey at the end. We do really appreciate it if you can fill that out to give us some feedback and information. And we hope that you will consider coming to other great talks with other great speakers. Thanks very much.